everybody. I'm Benny Torres. I'll be the moderator for this panel, which is Stories for a Better Business. I think first off the bat, I guess let's introduce ourselves. And a light introduction, then I have an introductory question. So let's go. Let's start.
I'm Marco Busse. I am the CEO of Trendy Entertainment, which is a video game company here in Gainesville, Florida.
I'm Payal Khurana, and I'm one of the co-founders of Star Space, which is a co-working and startup incubator here in Gainesville.
Hi, I'm Opeola Bukola. I'm an independent marketing and digital design consultant.
Good morning, I'm Matt Sheehan. I'm on the journalism faculty at the College of Journalism and Communications at the university.
And I'm a visiting lecturer at the University of Florida. So the reason I wanted to keep it brief is just to give everybody sort of a tangible sense of what businesses we might represent. I'm curious to get sort of your personal story or history in business. Sort of what businesses have you worked for, or do you work for, and let's start there. And maybe. Yeah, what business have you worked for, and then what do you think the thread is? What would you say sort of your personal, professional story thread might be? So I'll quickly go first. I've been 8 years in advertising. I worked in Chicago, and I think the thread that kind of pulls through, and I've worked for big agencies and small agencies, worked on Nintendo, worked on small businesses, and for me, I think the thread is about big corporations are a whole bunch of people, but they all have one purpose. And small businesses are a whole bunch of people, or maybe a handful of people, but they have one purpose. And I'm curious sort of how creativity can unlock the story of a whole bunch of people. I'm curious how sort of like with a unified voice we can kind of crystallize what is ostensibly a lot of different people's purposes into kind of a unified voice, I guess.
So for me, I guess professionally, it's always been in video games. Started, in arcade games and basically moved my way through. Had a lot of different roles though. Started as a programmer and it kind of ended up where I am now. And I think the thread that's run through it all is just evolution. I mean, back when I started, it was arcade games, Super Nintendo stuff, and now it's high tech Xbox Ones and PS4s. But everything keeps changing, and whether it's been for small companies, when I work for small companies, or very large companies, it's how does evolution change kind of your focus and the story, I guess, that you're as a business are sharing.
So for 8 years, I worked in healthcare IT, and I worked for 4 years, I worked for a big corporation, and then for 4 years, I decided to go work for myself in the healthcare IT world. And the story that I had in that time was always, how do I create an impact? Am I creating an impact? And I knew in that time, yes, I was creating an impact, but I didn't see it and I didn't feel it. So it was really important to me to do that. And so that's why I left and started Starter Space, because I really wanted to create a space that actually affected people or created a place that actually helped people work on things that they were passionate about. And in that time, I've also created another company called Find Mindfulness that teaches mindfulness to people. And again, that kind of pulls the thread there is, how am I impacting and how am I helping other people and myself? Because I struggle with mindfulness, and that was why I even started it. So it was more of, do I feel connected to these businesses and the work that I do on a daily basis?
So I've had probably a much shorter career than anyone else up here, but I think so I originally started a digital marketing agency. Now I'm doing digital marketing and accounting on my own. So the thread through that has really been that everything I've done has been involved with communication, and everything I've done has been digital. So I think bringing the digital world, using the digital world to kind of bring authenticity to businesses has been the big thread for me, especially when you're working on a remote team or you have a business that is completely online. It's really hard to make people still feel what I call the touchy-feelies of your business. So having that real authentic connection with your business. So that's something I always try to bring to every client that I work with.
So I have jumped around a bunch in my career. I've spent a lot of time in established and emerging media companies. 14 years in DC before moving down here. I was a news editor at the Post, was a chief operating officer at a digital media startup up in DC, and came down here to teach as well as to kind of work with our public media properties that the university has to make sure that we're entering the digital age. So my passion is all about, I feel like I should get my plate, Tracy. My passion's all about making sure that the ecosystem around the really critical communication that our democracy thrives on is going forward and really helping other people tell stories that maybe big business or the people in charge, the man doesn't want to hear, even though I am the man. But that's my passion. That's why I'm here. So I have jumped between working for people, working in startups, and now Benny and I really are creating this space for experimentation that folks like Alex get to come and play in a sandbox to develop the next kind of style of communication and media. So that's why I'm here.
And I just want to make sure that the audience or you guys recognize that, like, I definitely want this to be exchanged, so raise your hand if you got a question in the middle of it. There'll be some time at the end. But, my goal here for this panel is to get these sort of, like, business folks in Gainesville to be helping you guys tell better stories, and it is storytelling for better business, so I'm going to try to get some stories out of them, but certainly feel free to ask questions. The first question I have is kind of, I hope, leads the discussion. Marco, you and I were talking before the panel about sort of internal storytelling versus external storytelling. And I think that dichotomy is an interesting one to start with. So I'm curious, and whoever wants to kind of take the ball, take it. I'm curious to get the panel's take on internal storytelling from a business perspective, meaning and put a finer point on it, what stories do we tell our employees? What stories do we tell ourselves? How do we, if we're not aware of, what our business's story is, create a culture internally that maybe starts to distill it or make it apparent? And I love this notion of authenticity. How do we uncover the authenticity through internal storytelling in terms of our business?
Well, I think, the talk that we just went through is very kind of resonated with me a lot on trying to figure out what is your passion, what is the reason why your business is there, and trying to distill that into something that you can, at some point have a shorthand for, because it's just part of the culture and people are aligned and are on the same page. And that is the type of story that I think is important internally for your employees, to give them a sense of direction as to where you're trying to head to, kind of what does tomorrow look like. It's also important when you're trying to get new employees to come in. You want the best employees, and you want people that vision for where you're going to resonates with them. And so taking the time to make sure that internal story, that goal, that purpose for being in the company is one that succinctly kind of describes where your direction is and resonates with the people internally. I think is an important piece.
Okay. I'm curious, of course, pepper in. What? Not to put you on the spot. What's Trendy's internal story? What's Trendy's sort of shorthand internally? What's kind of the rallying cry?
I think for Trendy, the thing that we are looking to do is to put something out there. It's a video game company, so we're out there to create enjoyment. We're out there to put something out there that resonates with the people that play it, that it makes it, it feel like we are doing something that in a little way, it just increases the fun of life, essentially. And to put something out there that we can be proud of, that, kind of the name Trendy in and of itself kind of suggests that you're doing something different and you're setting trends. And so there's an internal thing about trying new experiments to put something out there that is different and resonates with our customers to create enjoyment.
Okay. Opie, I'm curious to get your take on it, just as someone who's worked with a couple of different businesses on trying to maybe distill or uncover that authenticity.
I would say kind of learning that internal story and figuring out what it means to be your company is extremely important, because it really does, or it really should inform what your external story is. What I generally tend to do with my clients when it comes to distilling their internal stories is I'm really inspired by the book Start With Why by Simon Sinek. The idea of, why things happen. And one of the reasons that has really inspired me is that within business, we come into a lot of conflicts within business, and sometimes bad things happen, and sometimes those bad things are very much external. So they're the kinds of things that your customers or your clients are really looking at you about, and it becomes really hard to have that external story and to say, here's what happened with that situation, and to kind of explain it to your clients and to smooth things over if you don't have a good internal understanding of that conflict. So I'm always working with my clients to kind of say, all right, this thing happened, like clearly someone screwed up here, but how are we processing that screw up? Like, what happened? How do we explain it? Why did it happen? What problems in the company caused it? And how are we going to kind of come to peace with what happened internally, such that we can express that externally, and we can smooth things over, say, this is what happened. Here we are being authentic, being truthful about the situation, but also expressing ourselves in such a way that we're not looking bad to those clients, and expressing ourselves in such a way that we can move on and be careful.
So I would add, I appreciate you opening the floor to everybody. This idea of internal stories resonates to me in such a way that it's like, when you have a clearly defined internal story in your organization, it helps the employees and your coworkers connect with the story of the organization. You find your purpose and your why and your meaning in the context of the organization as a whole. And I could say yes, the external story is informed by the internal, but in a lot of ways, the employee engagement, the employee satisfaction, the why, the purpose of somebody getting up and doing something every single day is the internal story. I would say is in some ways just as important as the story you're putting out there.
I kind of want to jump on that, Brandon, a little bit, because I don't think, often we think we can control our external story when we can't. Our brand is not what we say it is, it's what other people perceive it. So I think the internal story is actually much more important than the external story. And listening to my fellow panelists, I'm reflecting, and this kind of takes us off topic a little bit, but it's not just the story, the internal story, it's also the internal habit. Charles Duhigg wrote a book I think it's called The Power of Habit, which I highly recommend to anybody who's really interested in internal stories, or especially internal change. The example that keeps coming to mind, although it's slightly different, was during the Iraq invasion or occupation, there was a colonel or some high-ranking military officer who was trying to cut down on some of the civil unrest that happened every night in one of the Iraqi towns. We'll say Baghdad, I don't remember the exact specifics. So he really looked at the habit of why that happened. So yes, traditional models would be, let's go put a marketing campaign out there to, don't riot, don't do this. That's not what he did. What he did is he worked with the city government and made observations. So when the city no longer allowed food truck vendors or food vendors to congregate in that square, the evening unrest stopped. Why? Well, people got hungry, and instead of staying there all night, they went home to eat because there were no options for that. So he changed the habit of this to affect that change. And I really think that's, I think about that a lot within our organization at the university. There are a lot of habits that I think we need to change, and as we go through our strategic planning process, that constantly resonates. So I guess it is a little off topic, but I think that kind of resonates with what that story is, internal story that you tell. You can affect it much easier, in different ways than just communicating, talking at people.
But I'm not so sure that it's as off topic as you might think, because at least the way that I interpret it is business habits. We have those all the time, right? So it might be things that you don't think of that are telling your story. One of my favorite sort of insights from one of my mentors was, I was sort of asking him, how do I know a direction of the company as he was leaving it? And he goes, look at the next 3 people they hire and look at the next 3 people they fire. And that tells you that that is a habit. That is, if we are hiring 3 X's, then the company's maybe going in the direction of X. And I don't think even like as we do as people, where we don't stop and go, okay, what am I doing and why am I doing it? I think that happens a lot with businesses where you don't realize, oh, your behavior indicates who you are and what you're doing. Whether or not you like to admit it, your next 3 hires and your last 3 hires and then the next people to leave of their own accord kind of tell you a story internally. I'd love to get a little tangible, and I'm going to put it on Payal.
I was about to about to give you something tangible, which
Awesome.
is really funny. We're right there. Since, as for Starter Space, we started in the Firestone building, and we had a story in that building, and we were there for about a year and a half. And when we started, we didn't know what we were doing. We were just like, we want to build a place, we want people to be passionate, we want people to be able to build their ideas. And we actually, when we started, we were aiming towards students, towards young people, because we wanted to create something that we wished existed when we were in college. And the more and more we went through that year, the more and more we realized, working with students is really tough. To be honest, they're fickle. Commitment is really it's a struggle. So, we were investing so much time and energy and money in students, and they were like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm done. Running your own business is really, really hard. So a year and a half into what we were doing, within that time, we started looking at older people. We're like, okay, you know what? Let's just focus on the co-working part. And we started pulling in more older, people to come into our space. And then a year and a half in, it was still really hard. And I honestly was ready to throw in the towel. It's like, I'm done. I no longer want to do this because it was sucking me dry. And we were presented with the opportunity to move into Infinity Hall. Has anybody been? Awesome. And that, was a huge shift because the Firestone building is this beautiful, red brick, has a different story than Infinity Hall. Infinity Hall is modern. If you walk in it, it's can be cold. So it changed our story. And now, what were we, number one, asking ourselves, what are we going to do? Is this something we want to do? And how do we tell this story internally? And how do we tell it externally? And internally, we were like, this actually gave us a new opportunity. We were exhausted, and we were like, we now have people that want to support us, and we get to move in this $25 million building. And that was the story we shared with and Opie can be a testament to this, as, this is a new opportunity. We get to hit the reset button, and now we want the committed folks. Now we want the people who are going to be a part of our community and, hey, you're here to work. You're not here to just play around and not be passionate. So internally, we decided to also rebrand, and we still have Starter Space, but we changed it to Launchpad because Starter Space didn't fit the culture of what Infinity Hall was. And so we changed that name there, and we created Starter Space to be in a different building because we wanted to keep the essence of what we thought Starter Space was in the beginning of that. And I hope that helps with internally and externally. And a lot of people were looking at us like, well, wait, what is this Launchpad thing? And I still get questions on that. Do you still have Starter Space? Do you still, what? And that's, for us, is Launchpad is now actually that platform for students and, the older group as well. And Gary's a testament as well. But it's for the more committed. Now we're here, and we're actually going to work hard on our businesses. We're not here to play anymore.
So if I'm a small business owner in Gainesville, sitting in this audience, looking at us, and I'm thinking sort of, what does storytelling have to do with business, and how does it help my bottom line, or how do we even start uncovering my story? What sort of tangible first step, next step would you give them, or what would you counsel them in terms of getting started on figuring out what the internal story is? And I might start with just the pause. I think a pause and like thinking why you got into business, what you want to do. I had another mentor once tell me people get into business to be famous, to make money, or to change the world. And pick one, because doing all three is difficult. And so even starting with something that basic of like what is my personal motivation, I think sets you off on a story.
Can I ask a question that's related to that?
Yeah.
I think I'm hearing the word story and authenticity, and I keep thinking vision. And aren't those other words for vision, or how does vision enter into this process?
I'll bring it to the panel. What's the difference between vision and storytelling, I guess, as we've been talking about it?
I would say that in a lot of my experience, vision is a wonderful thing. Obviously, vision is really what drives us and what keeps us passionate about what we're doing. But I would say that your vision and your story are different, and you have to really acknowledge that difference, because your vision is always going to be this very idealistic thing, this thing that it's like a disco ball you might see on the ceiling. But it's this thing it's really flashy, and you're kind of looking up at it in the distance, right? And whereas your story is what is actually happening, or at least the story that you want to put out there is the story that is actually there, the story that is actually happening. So I would say it's extremely important to just acknowledge that. To hop back into the question Benny was asking, I think one of the most important first steps when it comes to telling your business story or figuring out what your business story is asking the people who have to tell it. So actually, Payal is a really, really great example. So when you guys were making the transition, when they were making the transition to Launchpad, I was one of the coworkers in Starter Space. So I experienced that entire transition with them. And it was really interesting because as someone who was starting a small business and who was doing that transition with them, I became one of the people who was helping them tell their story. So, people would ask me, what's going on with this difference? What is this thing, Starter Space versus Launchpad? And I remember close to when we were moving that they got everyone who was making the move with them into a room to kind of explain, here's why we're doing this. How do you guys feel about it? And we all just kind of got to talk to each other and talk to them about, this is the story, this is what's happening, this is what Starter Space will be and what Launchpad will be. So I think that's a really effective way to figure out where your story is going, because those people are telling it and those people are pushing it. They're really the liaisons between the internal and external story, because they are the ones who are going to be taking that story from internal to external.
So perhaps to build on what Obi was saying, and to answer another way of answering your question, perhaps your story is when your vision meets other people.
So would you have some tips on, let's say you're starting a nonprofit, and you're trying to write your mission and your vision, and people often say, well, they're similar, or you're starting to write them and you're like, they're turning out similar. Do you have any thoughts about that, or how you would delineate them being majorly different?
One thing I would say is I think that we tend, storytelling, and I love storytelling particularly versus vision and things like mission and all that kind of stuff, because as we've been talking about, storytelling is about authenticity, it's about your truth, and truth is very personal, hyper-personal. And I think oftentimes what I see in businesses is that they get into this business mindset, and not to be too off color here, but I call it business douche. That we tend to write in business douche. I'm writing a business paper for business people, and this is what my business is about. And unfortunately, that language isn't human, isn't authentic, isn't you. And so I would remind people that businesses are a human entity and try as much as possible to fight the demons of sort of business douche. And I think if you fight that off, your language will be more human, and most importantly, it's about stepping back, looking at what you've put out there, and asking, is this different from everything else I've seen? Does this reflect my authentic truth? The authentic truth of my business. I think too often we sort of stop telling our story and start telling the stories of other people, or the generic story in our heads of what the nonprofit says, or what a video game company says, as opposed to what makes trendy, what makes find mindfulness, maybe even warts and all a little bit, maybe even showing a little bit of vulnerability, and trusting that is maybe our difference. That would be sort of my take on it. I'm curious to get some non-writer,
The one thing I was gonna say is I think similarly, business douche around is we put so much it's a lot of pressure to be my mission. This is our mission, and it's gonna be our mission for the rest of time. Mission changes, as we're talking about that, and your vision is changing all the time, especially in the early years. So my one tip would be to be a little compassionate with yourself when you're writing, and in that authenticity, and hey, where am I right now in this moment? And it can change. It's okay if it changes. It doesn't have to be perfect.
How do you get people to bite if it's constantly changing?
I mean,
I'm
Brandon.
gonna jump in on that one. I'm gonna use this as an example. Narrate started as an LLC company, a for-profit business. We started as basically a short documentary film project. People started offering us money to give presentations, so we're let's create a business out of this. Let's legally set up some structure. And over the next 3 years, Jaren and I took a lot of time to reflect on these mission questions. They changed a lot. Where we are right now is very different from where we started. And as long as you have this core, strong internal story, which Jaren and I do, and talking about those 3 things that you're in business for, to make money, to be famous, or to change the world, we're not making any money, and we're not here to be famous. You're authentic to yourself, and your story is authentic to the world. It's okay if what you do changes over time. People will follow you. And so my recommendation is just start doing something that you believe in, and if you find that it works, great. If it doesn't work, pivot, but people will follow.
I actually think it's really important almost to make sure that you allow for that change, because it's that opportunity that you find. Sometimes you might be off on one path thinking that that's the right thing, but oftentimes it's that pivot or seizing on an opportunity that you didn't necessarily even think about that makes something special, makes something unique. And if you're too focused on, this is my mission, or this is my goal, and don't allow yourself to be, true to yourself or true to your situation, you might miss that opportunity.
But Marco, you said it, so I'm going to dig a little deeper. And I know everybody's dealt with changing their business, but I know for a fact that Marco, the product and sort of the business, there was a tangible, big shift that happened. And so I'm curious what, and you don't have to get into specifics, but just sort of as you're thinking about that massive shift that happened, what were the fears, what were the insecurities, and sort of how'd you come out the other end of sort of a massive shift in business, with clarity of story or clarity of vision?
Well, I mean, to be completely frank, I don't know if we have come out on the other end yet. We're still going through it. Trendy's got history. There's some history at Trendy that was before my time, but where the company has gone through a lot of hardship, both internally as well as focus on direction. In fact, we went through a layoff earlier in the year, and that was a very hard thing, because now you've got, we reduced in size by almost 50%, and that's a hard thing for people that are left to see, the people that they've worked with, their friends, leaving the company, and then trying to look internally about, okay, well, what is your direction, and how does that change given the circumstances, and does everybody still want to be here and fight for that? And it's it's a hard thing, and the thing that I would say there, the thing that I think is most important is, I think it's really important to have hope. I think it's important to make sure that the goal that you guys, that you as a company are fighting for is a goal that resonates with your employees. And I think it's also very important to be human and think of, in the context of story being where you are right now, acknowledging there is a past that got you here. There's a future that you're going to, but what is the situation now as well? And having that conversation with your employees.
Cool. Yeah. One last thing, and I'll go on to the next question list. I think too often business owners and just clients that I've seen, and I've worked with a lot of them, and it's funny, I've worked on everything from tacos to feminine hygiene to video games, and a lot of clients exhibit the same sort of habits. And one of the habits that I see is the sort of please all and please none syndrome. Well, we've got to be everything to everybody. And what about this? And what about that? And what about that audience? And what about this audience? And again, I'd remind us as business owners and as business people that to remember the storytelling bit, to think about you telling a story to someone. You're not really worried about, telling all the stories. You're not worried about telling all the angles of all the stories. You're looking at someone, an audience, and as you are telling your story, maybe changing some things based on how they're reacting, maybe changing some things based on who they are, but you're not trying to do everything. And I think, again, the business context puts that pressure on us to sort of be everything to everyone. And I think it's a lot more about saying no to things and distilling sort of down, okay, I'm not for moms in their 40s. I am for, 22-year-olds in college. Or I'm not for 22-year-olds in college. So it's something that I think, it's just a trap that I find a lot of people fall into.
Well, I think one way of looking at running a business from a storytelling perspective is it's less about audiences and more about communities. So our communication models have shifted so dramatically over the last decade that many businesses are still operating on that broadcast model, the one-to-many, where now you're one-to-one. You're communicating with your community directly, with your customers directly. And if you think of your business as, rather than building a business, building a community that provides value in both directions, I think that's where storytelling really comes in and becomes important, and you can identify those target or those subsets of the community that you really want to dive in on. Sorry to get all academic.
Putting you guys on the spot a little bit, I'm curious, has storytelling moved the needle for you guys at all? Let's talk about results, tangible results. Has storytelling for you guys as individual business people or for the businesses that you represented or the businesses that you own, has storytelling directly sort of moved the needle at all?
For me, I would say definitely, especially for my business on my own. Like I said, I've had a pretty short career. I'm only 24, so I've really been kind of working I've been doing this marketing thing probably for the last 3 or 4 years. So I started while I was an undergrad as an intern and then as an associate before kind of starting my own thing. And I think the fact that I am so young and have such a short career, means that telling my story becomes very, very important to kind of proving to people what my skill sets are. I'm kind of constantly telling people, okay, here's what my trajectory looks like. Here is how in 3 years I've done this thing and that thing and the other thing, and I've worked with this many companies, and I've been at this many levels of different businesses. So for me, telling my story has become, it's kind of become my number one way to market myself, because otherwise you're seeing, okay, this person has been working for 3 years and has this laundry list of accomplishments or a laundry list of things that she's done. So being able to actually tell that story and to create attachments and tell people, here's how this felt and here's what I learned from this has been extremely important for me.
I would say, to just take it to a very personal level, one of the most important things is your employees and kind of understanding your employees and understanding their fears and challenges and whatever. And oftentimes it's just in that conversation, when you're talking through something and listening to their story for kind of why they're in a certain mindset or what their hopes and dreams are or whatever, or fears, and then being able to make that personal connection and go, okay, well, yeah, you know, this reminds me of something personal from my standpoint that might relate and might give them perspective, and oftentimes it's just like that can make a huge difference just in the business relationship. I mean, I remember specifically there was a person that I worked with previously, and really good guy, and you know, loved working with him, but oftentimes we just butt heads and couldn't figure out why. And at one point in time, it was just a conversation with, well, like why is this happening? And part of it was, you know, from my perspective and my story, like how I got there, you know, I've always been very much of a problem solver, and that has worked really well for me in my career. But hearing somebody say, okay, well, I've got this problem or whatever, I started jumping in very often, and going, okay, well, we can do this, we can do that. And, you know, from his perspective and where he came from, worked in theater a lot beforehand, was very used to just kind of just talking about things, but not necessarily wanting to get into that problem solving right away, and just having me tell my story of how I got there, him tell his story of how we got there. We came up with a shorthand. It's like, okay, well, Marco, if I say, let's just brainstorm for a second or whatever, let's not go into problem solving, let's stay high, you know? Or if I come to you and say, hey, I need some help figuring this out, then let's go, you know, and it's just having that conversation and make it personal, just increase that relationship dramatically.
I have a weird inversion of this. As a consumer, a business has actually recently affected me on multiple levels with their story. And actually, Payal, you're connected to this. Payal brought to one of our meetings a big old, beautiful box of pastries with a business card that said Baker Baker on it. And I would say, step one, the product itself is a story. What you don't forget that all products are stories. This little case wallet tells me something about who made it. And those pastries themselves were so obviously delicious, but they felt handcrafted, they felt unique, they felt interesting. So sure enough, the next morning, I was like, cool, I want to go to that bakery. I go to the bakery, and it's just 3 family members working there. Cheery, hi, you know, son, mother, father, in a very sparse bakery with just a small little sort of rack of pastries. Another part of the story, the physical space, and even just without speaking, it's a family. They're making it themselves. It smells good. You know, it's not in the best neighborhood, or it's not in the best sort of state. But they're, you know, in my head, I'm creating a story immediately. And then happen to follow them on Instagram. On Instagram, they post when their pastries are sold out, and you can look at the timestamp and see 10 a.m., 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 7 a.m., and all of a sudden there's a third story there of like, okay, the product is good, it's a family-owned business, and oh, they're in hot demand and they only make a certain amount of things. So if that morning I get those pastries, my story all of a sudden changes, I feel good. And so as a consumer, it was interesting how, without even directly marketing, you know, their stories were sort of washing over me, and now I'm kind of spreading it to you guys, and now you guys have Baker Baker on your head. They're not being paid, or I'm not getting paid. But I want to kind of point out how that moves the needle. That you know, just by being their authentic selves, they kind of move the needle.
I also wanted to add one thing too. And I agree with that. Like, sometimes we're not like purposely like trying to move the needle. It might not be like this big marketing campaign, because I mean, even with Starter Space, a lot of people in Gainesville still don't understand co-working. They're like, why am I gonna pay money to come to some random office space and like work at a desk? Like, you're just giving me a desk and a chair. But it's, you know, truly the story is beyond that. It's like the community, and it's the people you meet and the people that are affecting you. Our story is you were affected by the 5 people that you surround yourself with, like-minded. So, you know, if the person next to you is working really hard, you are going to be motivated to work really hard. And Gainesville doesn't get that yet still. So it doesn't matter how many campaigns we do. The truth is, it's like when someone walks in and I give them a tour, that's like my personal connection with them is sharing our stories of like the little, not even little, it's the big impacts that have been made to the people that come into our space and become a member, you know, the value that they get. And that's not a story that we can put on a website, because people are gonna see through that, and I think it'll look really inauthentic. Like, oh, this person came in and got this many results. It just looks very. So I believe that storytelling, it very much, you can move the needle, but it depends on how you're doing it. And interestingly, with Baker, they're doing it very authentically. They're not trying to. They don't have this big marketing campaign. It can be really genuine as your storytelling.
And that's why I appreciate Brandon sort of putting this together and having a business track, because I do think that we often forget that when we're introduced to sort of marketing or advertising, the walls go up, and and immediately we are not listening as an audience. We are listening as being advertised to. So last question, because this is Gainesville's first storytelling conference, I'm curious to get the panel's take on Gainesville's role in your business story. What does Gainesville uniquely offer, or does it offer anything uniquely to your business? And because we've been talking about community, we've been talking about audiences and all that kind of stuff. So I'm curious to get your take on what Gainesville specifically sort of can do for your story or has done for your story.
Well, as part of our story, I mean, obviously the company was founded in Gainesville. It was founded by people that were going to the university, came out and wanted to create this. And so that's certainly part of the story, like why was it founded and why are we here? I think part of the challenge that we have with being in Gainesville is it's not really a hub for video game development, and a lot of times when you're talking to people that are located in California or Austin or some other places that is more of a tech hub for this type of development, part of it is certainly selling them on the company or selling them, like hoping that what we have to offer for a company resonates with them, but also trying to explain, well, what about Gainesville? Why would you even consider moving out here? And so I think a lot of times it is people that would like to move away from some of those other areas and trying to find some things about like being in this area of the country that actually connects with them. I think frankly, one thing that we're not doing that well that I think we really should figure out how to do better is making a better connection with the university and the students that are coming through there. We've had some internships that have worked out really well from that, but there's a nut to crack there, and it seems like it would be a simple thing, but it's not quite so simple. So.
Gainesville has been a huge part of our story. So I lived in San Francisco, I've lived in New York, and a lot of people ask that question, like, why did I move to Gainesville? And it's because Gainesville is a fertile ground for starting new companies. I mean, this is the story that we share with anyone that has an idea that walks into our spaces. It's really easy to move to San Francisco, move to New York because it's flashy and like, yeah, I'm in a big city. But Gainesville, it's got a lot of resources and it's a lot cheaper. A lot cheaper. So if you're gonna start your company, Trendy saw that, even though there's not other video gaming companies. Even Immersed Games, they feel the same way. But your money goes a long way. So Gainesville has been in the fabric of our story the whole way through.
I would say Gainesville has been a big part of my story as well, and kind of in two kind of like strangely different ways. So for the majority of this year, I actually worked as a design consultant for the city of Gainesville. So I got to see Gainesville kind of from a different perspective as far as where it affects my story. So working with the city, I was kind of seeing Gainesville from like this like strange. Like I was learning a lot about the construction going on in Gainesville and how more construction is going on in the city than has ever been going on before. And I got to learn about kind of the communities in Gainesville and how they're growing and how they're becoming kind of more administratively sound on their own, and how that's having a really huge effect on the city and just all the events that are coming here and like the food trucks that are coming here, things like that. So in like kind of from that perspective, Gainesville is actually as an actual city entity growing in such a huge way. And I think the effect that part had on me was understanding that Gainesville's kind of growing in the same way that we are growing as business owners. So I've I always kind of joke with people that like I'm in Gainesville finding myself, like doing the eat, pray, love thing, because like so I have 2 older siblings. They both live in New York City. Like it would be very easy for me to move, somewhere very flashy, and I people have always told me I have that personality of somebody who would live in a big city, and so it's interesting for me to be able to kind of discover myself as a person and as a business owner in a place that's not like that at all. It's been a really interesting resource because a lot of my clients are like on the West Coast or up in New York. So for me, it's been an interesting experience in being somewhere else, like being somewhere so different and so far removed from everybody else. I have a client that I talk to almost every day, and they're out in San Francisco. So they're 3 hours behind us, and just the culture that they're in and the culture that I'm in are so different that it's sometimes like actually laughable. To the point that Payal made, like it is so much cheaper to live in Gainesville, and people really appreciate that because they're like you don't really charge as much as like we would kind of like expect you to, and I'm like, I pay like $500 in rent, like I don't have to, so that's a big part of it. I also think that the other big part of it is that like Gainesville has like a kind of like a certain silence and stillness to it that makes it really a great place to reflect. And I think that's had a really big impact on my story. Just being somewhere where I can be surrounded by nature really quickly, but I can also be surrounded by community really quickly. I can also be surrounded by youth really quickly. I can also like be really obnoxious because like Lord knows all of our Gator sports teams are like that. And so I think all of those things have really made Gainesville feel like such a big opportunity and such just a great place to grow in a general sense for me.
Quick last word, Matt?
So my Gainesville story obviously is centered around the university because that's what brought me down here. But over the last 5 years, it's been really fun to kind of watch Gainesville's story itself evolve. For a long time, I think in the first couple of years, the story was it's not really, or centered around Saturdays in the fall as the only thing that mattered in town. But now I really see a lot more opportunity and growth in organizations like these and the whole town gown progress. I mean, obviously, every Austin or San Francisco or the trendy towns started like this, and I think it's going to be interesting to see what Gainesville evolves into.
Cool. Yeah, and the last thing I'd say is I remind everybody here that we are kind of part of Gainesville Story, and frankly, our businesses are part of Gainesville Story, so part of the momentum here is us. Thanks, Brandon, and thanks to panel. Thanks, audience. Yeah, really appreciate it.